Ding dong crap. All right, we're going to go ahead and get rolling here. So welcome to the second lecture of scientific inquiry. Today, I just want to make sure we all know that there's a website for this class too, and it'll look awfully familiar. You've probably noticed by now that I'm not really that tricky, and I do pretty much the same thing over and over and over. And I think that that consistency is probably helpful, but what do I know? So this is going to look a lot like MedPath, except the content will be totally different. So these classes are only going to meet once a week, and they run for 2 hours instead of just the one. I think that's actually going to work well for this class. I'm not going to introduce a lot of new stuff here. We're going to be revisiting topics from last semester, and we're going to be applying them. That's the major focus of this class, is applying the stuff that we've learned about research and statistics so that we can do some critical appraisal of the evidence. That's what this class is. So some of the comments about last semester were that, it didn't really seem too applicable. There was too much stuff. The good news is, aside from ANOVAs, I don't really think I'm adding anything new here. T-tests are still t-tests. Correlations are still correlations. We're looking for p less than 0.05. All that stuff is still true. And now we're just going to be applying it to the literature. So what I envision for the class is we'll spend about an hour or so with me delivering a lecture, at least for the first 5-ish meetings. We only have 5 lectures in this class. And then the other half of it, we'll take a little break, and then we'll try to do something with the topic. So next week, for example, searching the literature. I'll tell you how I like to search the literature, and then you'll do it. So you'll make sure that you can do the stuff that we're talking about. When we talk about understanding the evidence, the second half of the class will be you trying to apply what we talked about. So we'll look at some ANOVAs, and you'll tell me whether there's main effects, interaction effects, what those mean. So you'll get a chance to apply what we're talking about. Let's go ahead and have a look at the class website. There it is. Any problems getting onto the class website? Cool. So the syllabus is up there. That's worth taking a look at. We'll do that. You can still schedule a meeting. There's a calendar with the exams and when the cats are due. This is all the same. You can give me some feedback. I'll get an email if you put in feedback, and I'll make adjustments. I am certainly willing to change my behavior, and that's why I'm still happily married. So let's have a look at the syllabus. It should look something like this. You can have a look at it. What I want to get to would be the grading, because that's what you want me to get to. So we'll have some exams. There'll be 2 of them, and then there's a final exam. I don't know if you can see this superscript here. Super implies that it's really important and powerful, and this one is really important. This is a superscript, because if you look down at the bottom, what I'm telling you is that if you show improvement on the final exam, I'll replace your exam 1 or your exam 2 score with that final exam score. because the final exam is going to cover stuff from exam 1, it'll cover stuff from exam 2. If you didn't really get a NOVAs the first time around, but you got it the second time, great. I'll substitute that in. I want us to all do well in this class. But you'll see here, the bulk of your grade is going to come from appraisals. How do you do on those critical appraisals? That's what this class is about. And the final exam is going to have you do a very brief critical appraisal. So you're going to do about 3.5. I'm going to count the final exam as a half appraisal. You know, 3.5 different appraisals. There's also a very brief presentation. So you'll do a group presentation at the end. That's described up here. So there's a segment that's going to describe critical appraisals. Have a look at that. We'll go through it though together in a lecture where I talk about using the tools I've made for you. And then there'll be plenty of time for you to get together, discuss, and ask questions. So this will all make a whole lot of sense. Do give this a look. I'm not going to read it to you. But I do want to make sure we're all aware that your third critical appraisal is going to be done in group form. You'll all do a different critical appraisal, but you'll all have a similar PICO question. And then you'll gather different bits of evidence and see how well they line up. And then you'll give us a presentation on it. 4 minutes. So it's not a lot of time. You do want to be quick here. You know, in previous years, we penalized presentations that ran over, and I'm going to continue that tradition. I think it was great. So I'm going to steal that from Kiesel. He's the guy who taught this before me. So we're going to continue that tradition here. The grading scale, you can see, is the same as everywhere else. I might curve if I need to, because I understand grades are relative. Come to class and don't cheat. And then here's the schedule. So today is technically lecture 1. Truth be told, there's not a whole lot to talk about. We just need to understand what a PICO question is. That's about it. So there's really only 4 lectures here. Searching, understanding, checking, and knowing the evidence. That's the process of evidence-based practice, or at least most of it. Integrating it into your clinical expertise, that's not something we're going to do in this class. You'll do it after you have clinical expertise. But we'll cover that part of it. Coming up with a question is what today's about. Finding the evidence is what next week is about. Making sense of that evidence, week after that, we'll have an exam after that. And then we'll think about, well, how much should I believe that evidence that I now understand? And then we put it all together in the end. The reading is up there for the 3rd and 4th editions. And that's the syllabus. Here's the different lecture pages here. We're going to be on lecture 1 today. I try to put up reviews that might be a little helpful. You know, it's hard for something like this lecture and next week's lecture. Like, how do I give a multiple choice question about searching the evidence? Instead, we're going to spend time searching for the evidence. And if you can find an article, great. You know what you're doing. Multiple choice questions aren't really well suited for that. As always, there's a questions box. So if you go in this box here, you can type in your question. And then you'll submit it and it'll show up in this sheet below. Don't try to enter it in the sheet, that won't work. So that's the process we're going to go through in this class. We're going to go through basically evidence-based practice. There's some additional pages that aren't marked as lectures. So let's have a look at those. The CATs, the critical appraisals that you'll be filling out. So there's 2 different types. There's critical appraisals of therapy trials and then critical appraisals of diagnostic studies. I've created some templates for you to use, and I'll put a little button so you can easily make a copy on here, but you can see the grading rubric on there. And what I've done, because I'm a very simple man, is make sure that this grading rubric lines up with your template. So you're not kind of looking around, where does this apply? Where is this stuff? It all should follow basically the same order. If you think there's a way that I can improve this, please let me do. I'll show you this in the class dedicated to these, but you'll click in, you'll type some stuff in these boxes. Anywhere you see a box, you'll fill it out. And it should be, I think, a logical exercise for you. Doesn't mean it'll be quick or easy the first time you do it, but after you do a few, you'll get used to it. We are going to be working with some spreadsheets just a little bit. So I've made some tools for you, and we'll go through those when the time comes. That is to say, I will not ask you to do math in this class. You should, unless you enjoy math, you should never do math. You're not as good at it as a computer. I don't mean any offense to anyone, but you're just not. So we're going to have computers do it for us. So I got some calculators I've made for you. You know, I'd rather just view this. I don't want to make a copy. So you can fill in the mean, the standard deviation, and the sample size for your different groups. We'll run through this, and it's going to do all the calculations you need for your confidence intervals. It'll get some p-values for you. And heck, I'll even tell you if it's significant and if it's meaningful, as long as you put in the MCID down here. This, I think, should make a ton of sense. But again, what do I know? If it doesn't make sense, get at me so I can improve it. So you're looking at version 2. I hope to improve it based on your feedback. So I'm trying to make the class easy. Well, logically arranged, I'll say that. So you'll do a few cats. We'll have time in class for you to come together and chat with one another. The first 2 cats, I'm going to give you an article to read. The third one, I'm going to give you a PICO question, and you're going to go find the evidence. So that's going to be a little bit different. I'll put you in groups, and you'll work together on your cats and your presentation. There's a grade book at the end, just like in MedPath. The group cat's just going to give you both the therapy and diagnostic, because it depends on what kind of question you come up with. All right. Any questions on kind of the general scheme of the class? Cool. All right. Well, then let's talk a little bit about evidence-based practice. And really, it's just about PICO questions. That's all we're really introducing today. So I want to talk about the different types of research. We'll eventually find our way to clinical research, because that's what this class is about. And then we'll talk about the elements of evidence-based practice. So before I came here, I never looked at clinical research. But it turns out that stuff exists. There are different types of research. It's not just basic science. That's the world that I lived in. And in basic science, we ask, how does the world work? We don't necessarily care if it's helpful to anyone. We just want to know, how does the world work? For example, how are traits inherited? That's what Gregor Mendel wondered when he was crossing his pea plants. How can I make some tall ones? Maybe I like purple flowers. How can I make sure I get more purple flowers? Is it necessarily helpful? I don't know. Maybe it will be someday. So the idea of basic research is that it might not help us right now to understand nature, but you never know when that will be helpful. Because from his work with pea plants, maybe you don't care about pea plants, we discovered genetics. We eventually found that it was DNA, and by altering DNA, you then change the RNA and the proteins, and when you change proteins, you change function. Why are the tall plants taller? They have different versions of genes called alleles than the short ones. So basic research just kind of asks, how does the world work? We want to understand life. May or may not be helpful. Translational research seeks to take that information from basic science and move it away from the bench to the clinic. Can we take what we've learned about gene expression and maybe apply it outside of just some dude's lab? For example, can we make targeted mutations? Can we change certain elements of DNA to maybe have some useful function? You'll see in this picture 5 different mice. You might see that 2 of them are special. So they glow green because they have green fluorescent protein. That's a protein that fluoresces green when you shine blue light on it. So the name makes a ton of sense. Mice don't normally have this. Jellyfish have it, but mice don't. But you can make them express it. So they put it under the ubiquitin promoter. It's ubiquitously expressed, as you might imagine, so that they're green all over the place when you turn a blue light on them. Not particularly helpful, but that technology, the ability to make targeted changes in gene expression, turns out to be incredibly useful for diseases that are caused by specific mutations. So by understanding how genes work, and by understanding how to actually change genes, we can then apply that in the clinic. And none of this would have been possible without Mendel playing with his pea plants. The clinical application here would be, can we use gene therapy to treat some disease? The example shown here would be immunodeficiency caused by a very specific mutation in the enzyme adenosine deaminase. That's ADA there. So for people who don't have functional adenosine deaminase, they have very low levels of immune cells, and therefore they have almost no immune function. And that immunodeficiency severely compromises their health. Well, what if we could fix that mutation? And it turns out we can. We can genetically alter stem cells, then inject them into patients, and now they have functional stem cells. They can then create the immune cells shown in panels A through D. Those are just different types of immune cells. And what you'll notice here, they had 10 different, that'd only be 9 different patients shown here. Looks like 8 dropped out. But in all those cases, a marked increase. They go from essentially none to many. And that's maintained over the course of, they followed with one person up to 7 years. So long-lived gain of immune function. The enzyme works, is what panel E is showing us. And it works similar to what you see in healthy controls. Much better than before gene therapy, that's for sure. And this is a functional readout. They're just looking at the breakdown of adenosine. So adenosine deaminase deaminates adenosine. So the name makes sense. So the enzyme works, and they start to make a bunch of immune cells, and their immune function improves. So these types of research don't really work in isolation. It starts with basic research. We have to understand how the world works so that we can then try to affect health. Ultimately, what you care about is, of course, clinical research, and that's what we're going to look at here. But you should keep in mind, none of that's going to be possible if we don't understand how the world works. And conversely, who cares how the world works if it doesn't help us? So these different types of research, although you can call them different, they rely on each other. They're only important because of the others. Now, that clinical research can come in a few different flavors. The 3 broad categories would be experimental, exploratory, and descriptive. And when we say experimental, what we mean is that we are manipulating variables. That's what it means to be an experiment. The best example of this would be a randomized controlled trial, RCTs. These provide the best evidence for cause and effect relationships. If I make this change and I observe a difference in health outcomes, I can attribute it to the change that I made. What I'll do, I'll recruit a big old cohort of folks, and then I'll randomly assign them, and then I will make the change. That shows cause and effect. It's not always possible, though. I'm not going to recruit people and say, here, smoke 2 packs of cigarettes every day. You're randomly allocated to the high-risk cancer group. You don't smoke. Sometimes you can't do a randomized controlled trial. It would be unethical to try to give someone cancer just so you have a higher level of evidence. In that case, we turn to exploratory research. So cohort and case control studies. And I'll go through the types of designs in the next lecture. But basically what we're doing there with cohort, we're recruiting people who have certain risk factors and we're looking for outcomes. So we recruit, let's say, smokers and non-smokers, and then we follow them over time and look for lung cancer. Case control is we recruit people with lung cancer, people without lung cancer, and then we go to look for risk factors. So with case control, we start with the disease and look for the cause. In cohort, we start with the cause and then look for the disease. So they're similar, but we're not making the manipulation. So we don't feel as confident saying that there's a cause and effect relationship, because maybe something that predisposes a person to smoke also predisposes them to cancer or some other behavior that leads to cancer. So we're not just changing one thing, but we're trying to identify potential relationships that we can then study with experimental randomized controlled trials. And then there's good old descriptive research, not to be overlooked. You know, this is an important way to understand what might a patient look like if they have, I don't know, radial nerve damage or something like that, or if they have spinal cerebellar ataxia. So with descriptive research, it's just like descriptive statistics. It's there to describe. You might have only a person in a case study, or it might be a group in a case series, or you might just want to have normative data. How far should healthy young adults be able to jump in a broad jump? What's a normal range? Something like that. You know, and this can be very useful for identifying people who are far outside the norms. This could also involve looking at social behaviors in children to identify autism spectrum disorder early on, something like that. So just because it's descriptive and we say it's lower level doesn't mean it's not important. Just like your basic translational and clinical research, these 3 branches are also related to one another. They inform one another. That said, randomized controlled trials definitely show the best evidence for cause and effect relationships. So if you want to say that your manipulation did something, that's the best place to go looking for your evidence. And that's what evidence-based practice is all about, is finding and using the best current evidence to guide your clinical decision-making. There's a few different ways of trying to describe evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine, doesn't matter what you call it, but they all have the same idea in common. The way that you work with your clients should be based on the best current evidence and your clinical expertise. So you should be guided not only by what you have been taught works, but also what you've gone to search for that might be helpful. So you have to incorporate the evidence into your practice. But of course, you have to think about the values of the patient. If surgery is the best option, but they absolutely do not want surgery, they're not going to go that route. It doesn't matter what the evidence says. If they really want general anesthesia, even though a nerve block leads to fewer post-operative complications, well, they're going to get general anesthesia then, because ultimately they're the one paying the bill. But your goal is to find the best current evidence, be able to communicate that with your patients, and incorporate that into your practice. 5 steps to it. You got to ask an answerable question. That's what today is about. Just making sure we're all aware of PICO questions. You probably know far more about these than I do. But you need to ask an answerable question. Because if it's not answerable, what's the point in asking it? It's just like in any experiment, your hypothesis has to be testable. So the more specific your question, the better. For those unlucky half of you whose writing assignment I graded last semester, you probably saw me write specific is terrific. That's still true. You want to be as specific as you can because that's going to help you find the best available evidence. Ask a good question, get a good answer sometimes. Ask a poor question, get a poor answer all the time. Because that second step, finding the best available evidence, that's what next week is about. That's only going to be possible if you ask a good answerable question. Then you need to be able to, of course, make sense of that evidence. That's the third step there. That's what we'll spend the rest of the class on. And then you need to think about the evidence based on what your experience has been. You know, because you might read that this this diagnostic test is very much effective at detecting thoracic outlet syndrome, something like that. And in that author's hands, it worked really well. But you know that you've tried it before and it's crap in your hands. Then you wouldn't use it. We're all snowflakes, and there might be that one weird trick that makes that test work, but that one weird trick might just be clickbait and it's all bullshit. So you always want to take into account your expertise. So it's not evidence trumps all, it's you incorporate evidence. And of course, the patient matters too. You know, do they have certain risk factors that mean you shouldn't adopt some approach, or do they not want a certain approach because their values are different? And does it make sense in terms of time, right? The resources that you have available. You know, not everywhere is going to have a PET imaging facility. And so if PET is the best way of diagnosing a disease, it doesn't matter if that's not available to you. So you got to go with something else. All right, so ask an answerable question. There's two types of questions that you could ask. There's a background kind of question that's kind of more disease-oriented. What causes mechanical neck pain, for example? That's more focused on the disease. What's creating this disease? That's not what you think about whenever you're trying to treat a patient, but it is what you think about whenever you're trying to become expert in your field. So background questions are more related to your education. Foreground questions are more patient-focused rather than disease-focused. They're going to come in the form of PICO questions. Sometimes they're also PCOT, where they'll put timing at the end, but we'll stick to PICO. Patient, intervention, comparison, and outcome. You might not always have a comparison. You might just want to know if a certain intervention is helpful for some outcome. So an example, in middle-aged patients, is manipulation more effective than therapeutic exercise in the management of mechanical neck pain? So both questions written up there have to deal with mechanical neck pain. One is about the disease, one is about how to help a patient. PICO questions are what you need to practice coming up with. Again, specific is terrific because they're going to help you in your search. So another example, in elderly patients with a recent stroke, does constraint-induced movement therapy compared to other therapies result in better arm motor function at 1 year? So you have a specific patient, an older patient who recently had a stroke. You got a very specific manipulation in mind or intervention in mind. You kept it general with comparisons. Who cares? I want to know how this thing I'm thinking about compares to other possible treatments. And you have a specific outcome that you care about. I know they want to have better arm motor function, so the ability to move around, grasp things of that nature. That is going to help guide your search. So with that PICO question in mind, I went ahead and did a search. There it is. There's the best current evidence in case you care to look at it. This is what lecture 2 is about. Searching your PICO question. So we'll learn some tricks for making sense of PubMed. There are other databases that are available. PubMed is a great one to use though. We're going to practice this more in lecture 2. I'll show you how I like to do searches. There are some ways of going about finding full text, which I'm a little hesitant to share with the group, but we'll see. Then you need to analyze the evidence. That's what the rest of the class is about. You need to be able to understand that data. Lecture 3. So that's, again, stats. Make sure you understand the stats. It's really not that difficult. Then you need to think about whether or not there's acceptable reliability and validity in the measures that they have there. And you got to think about the types. Sometimes you don't really need to think about validity. It's a questionnaire. Look at the questions on it. Are these questions related to what you care about? Great. The only thing that affects validity is whether or not they lied. And you're not going to measure that. You don't know if they lied. But it's good to know that they're using commonly used assessment tools. You know, they didn't just eyeball whether or not they can move. They actually measured the angle. They measured strength in some quantitative fashion. And then summarize that evidence. That's what Lecture 5 is about, right? Coming up with your confidence intervals for the effect. So thinking about what are the possible scenarios that could exist based on these data, and completing a critical appraisal. Now, in the real world, you're not going to fill out a critical appraisal. When you know you have a patient coming to see you tomorrow and you want to do your literature search beforehand, you don't get out your CAT template and fill it out. But we're going to practice that now, because you're going to apply those skills. You just won't fill out the template. My wife does this all the time. She doesn't do a CAT, but she does a literature search. She reads. She thinks about how she can apply that to her patients. And of course, then there's the things we're not going to talk about in this class that you're only going to know whenever you meet that individual patient and whenever you get your experience in the clinic. So you got to think about cost, risks, and what your patient wants, of course. You know, and risk can sometimes be difficult to determine with the evidence. Because think about the highest level of evidence. Let's head on back here. That randomized controlled trial. That's what everyone wants to see. Have you shown it in a randomized controlled trial? And for some people, that's the only thing they care about. If you have a risk that's 1 in 10,000, you're never going to detect it in a randomized controlled trial. You're not powered to detect those. In that case, actually a case control might be the best approach. Oh, but that's not the highest level. It kind of is, though, for looking at rare events. So I'm going to present to you a hierarchy of evidence, but I want you to keep in mind that it depends. The randomized controlled trial is not always the best approach. Sometimes case control studies are the best when you're looking at rare events. So determining risk can be difficult with randomized controlled trials, and determining cost can be difficult with randomized controlled trials. You know, cost effectiveness, things like that. So some things you can't get from the evidence. But when possible, you should be making judicious use of the evidence and using that to guide your practice. All right. That's the basic intro to the class. Next week, we're gonna talk about searching the literature. We're gonna all be together, 6 feet apart in Smythe. I'll have some slides and I'll talk at you for a little bit, but we'll spend plenty of time making sure we can search for and find a full text version of the current best evidence. If you can do that, then you're well on your way to properly practicing evidence-based practice. Of course, we got to make sense of it, and we'll do that in the lectures after that. All right, any questions for me?
I have a question.
Yeah.
At the end of your your reading notes, I just want to know the answer to the first question. I want to know if I got it right.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see what I wrote. Hold on. All right. Let me find your class. Okay. All right, review question. So read the abstract. The one about syphilis and HIV transmission?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, great. I have my guesses here, but let me take a quick look to make sure I'm remembering the study correctly. Okay, yeah, non-commercial men who have sex with men. They're going to an STD clinic in China, and we're looking at the odds ratio of having HIV and syphilis based on different behaviors that they're looking at. So they're trying to link up some disease with risk factors. Does that sound about right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. What does that sound like to you?
I said it was descriptive.
Okay. There are definitely some descriptions going on. No doubt about that. So tell me what descriptive research means to you.
Well, it seemed like a really particular group of people. It doesn't seem like the average, like everyday person. So it describes a very specific set of something, and like why it's occurring. It tries to explain it, I guess. Maybe.
Continue.
I'm gonna walk myself back, so I don't want to.
So maybe they didn't explain why it happened in terms of a cause and effect relationship, but were they trying to identify any potential risk factors?
Honestly, like there was so much stuff in that description. Lost.
Fair enough.
So,
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let me see if I can bring this up here. Oh, shit. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to say that. Okay, let me share this screen over here. So we're all looking at the same thing. We're seeing this? Good, good. Now, if they were just describing the prevalence of HIV and syphilis, I would totally agree with you. That's just descriptive. They are just saying, here's the prevalence. But they went beyond that, I think. And if we go on down, my eyes kind of gloss over in background and methods. I always just kind of laser focus on the results first, and then I kind of jump around. So I'm going to go ahead and do what I do and jump to the results here. So they got 533 folks here, and 13.3% of them had HIV and syphilis. Then they did some kind of analyses looking at multiple variables, and they were looking at where they lived and having first anal sexual intercourse before the age of 18. And notice what they're putting in parentheses over here. What in the heck is that? Anyone can chime in, by the way.
the odds ratio and confidence interval.
Yes, exactly. Now the A there might not stand for what you think it does. That stands for adjusted. So it's an adjusted odds ratio. It means that they're adjusting it based on multiple factors. And what they think is that the odds are 2.78 times higher that you'll see HIV and syphilis co-infection if they had their first anal sexual intercourse before the age of 18. They're trying to identify risk factors. They're trying to identify a relationship between first anal sexual intercourse and the co-infection of HIV and syphilis. Maybe to identify some relationship between these variables. So you'll notice they're not just describing, they are trying to make a guesstimate about how much risk is involved with these different behaviors here. Now, they're not saying there's a cause and effect relationship, but they're trying to identify risk factors here. They're not just describing. So what do you think this might be?
Explanatory or
Exploratory, yeah. Yeah, they're exploring. Right now, they're trying to identify What are some potential risk factors? Now, again, this is something you could not study in a randomized controlled trial. You cannot randomly allocate someone to first sexual intercourse before the age of 18. So some types of questions can really only be answered with exploratory research. But when you consistently show elevated risk, let's say of developing HIV with intravenous drug use, well, now we can identify behaviors that we might want to correct then. So what you might do, is start handing out clean needles and see if that decreases, the amount of HIV infection in that population. Or in this case, not always using a condom. What if we make condoms more readily available? Right. So here they're trying to explore the idea, the connection between certain sexual behaviors and the risk of developing disease. I would call this exploratory. If they only said 13.3% of the non-commercial men who have sex with men in Shenzhen, China, have HIV and syphilis, that would be purely descriptive. But it's that additional analysis that then makes it exploratory. Any other questions for me? Excellent. Well, if anything comes up, you know how to reach me. I got an email address. I got questions boxes, fill them out. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next week.